In one of its meanings, intelligence is synonymous with the light of Christ. The LDS Guide to the Scriptures gives it this meaning. It is this intelligence that cleaveth to its own. Yet the nature of intelligence runs deeper. Intelligence, the light of Christ, is independent and acts for itself. In other words, intelligence is more than a phenomenon or an attribute. It is a distinct entity or being. To act for itself, that is, in its own self-interest, means that there is a self with a personal interest. This brings us to the book of Abraham. The LDS Guide to the Scriptures posits two more related meanings of intelligence, specifically in context with the book of Abraham. Intelligence is either a spirit or spirit element. The guide hedges on both meanings, using the word may. The church is, for all intents and purposes, guessing. The problem is that both can't be right. The guide is referring to intelligence in the plural. In other words, it is referring to the passages in the 3rd chapter of the book of Abraham, since intelligence in the plural is found nowhere else in Scripture. The statements by the Lord are difficult and obscure without a firm definitional basis in Scripture. We must remember that the word intelligences is a translation from the record of Abraham recorded on the Egyptian papyri. Whatever the original word was in Abraham's tongue, Joseph had to find a word that was approximate to the original meaning. Now, this is true of all translation. A translation is never an exact copy of the original. It is an approximation. The word Joseph selected was intelligences. If we go back to the lexicon of Joseph's time, we find there is only one meaning of intelligence that can be used in the plural and also refers to living entities. Intelligence, in the 1828 Webster Dictionary, refers to a spiritual being. It is important to note that Joseph did not choose the word spirit, which had a similar meaning in the 1828 Webster Dictionary. Webster cites 1 Peter chapter 3. Spirit is used in the plural and refers to spirit beings. Theoretically, either word, intelligence or spirit, could have been used to translate the word used by Abraham, since a spirit is an intelligent being and an intelligence is a spiritual being. But Joseph made a distinction between intelligence and spirit. And we know this because in the very next verse, Joseph uses spirit to translate another original word used by Abraham. At first glance, intelligence and spirit, not to mention soul, appear to be used interchangeably. However, we must remember that this is a translation. Joseph, as translator, is bound to translate the original text as written and not just according to his fancy. The translations are not interchangeable because they're translations of different words in the original text. That is, the word translated as intelligences, the word translated as soul, and the word translated as spirit are different in Abraham's original account. In other words, Abraham made a distinction between intelligence, soul, and spirit, which Joseph honored in his translation. This being the case, then spirit and intelligence, when referring to living entities, cannot be synonymous. They can be similar or related, but they're not the same. Therefore, the Guide to the Scriptures' third meaning for intelligences as a reference to spirit children is incorrect. Intelligences, then, can only be individual and material beings which are different from spirits, souls, and beings with physical bodies. The Lord made this point when he informed Abraham that he had actually seen intelligences. Joseph Smith knew and understood the doctrines of spirits and intelligences. After all, it was he who translated the Book of Abraham and received the revelations on the topic. So it is not surprising that he taught the saints what he knew, at least in part. He did so in the King Follett sermon, given in General Conference 2.5 months before his martyrdom. The sermon was recorded by 4 witnesses: Willard Richards, Wilford Woodruff, Thomas Bullock, and William Clayton. All subsequent accounts were based on 2 or more of these recordings. None of the accounts were complete, but the combination of all 4 provided a fairly accurate record of Joseph's comments. Joseph covered a lot of topics, but we will focus only on one: the mind of man. Midway through the discourse, Joseph Smith changed course and addressed a new topic. According to the 4 reports, the topic was the immortality of the soul, mind, and spirit of man. The Times and Seasons report the switch in topics this way. We must be careful here. An amalgamated version sometimes is additive in nature, meaning the composite is greater than the parts. According to the Times and Seasons version, the topic is the resurrection of the dead, with specific reference to the soul, mind, and spirit of man. It is true that Thomas Bullock included all 3 in his account. But William Clayton included only 2, the soul and mind of man. The 2 other accounts also excluded the spirit. Wilford Woodruff included only the soul and mind. Willard Richards, whose account was extremely abbreviated, mentioned only the soul. Later, while speaking on this topic, Joseph does mention spirit, mind, and soul. At times, he appears to use the terms interchangeably. However, like we did with the Book of Abraham's treatment of intelligences, souls, and spirits, we will have to be very careful to the details. In this case as well, souls, minds, and spirits can be distinct and separate concepts. The version of the sermon found in Joseph Fielding's collection, The Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, is a composite. It is similar, but not the same as the account in the Times and Seasons. In this version, Joseph equated the terms soul, mind of man, and immortal spirit. The footnote to this statement makes this point and declares that all 3 refer to the intelligence and not to the spirit being of man. Joseph is referring to the intelligence in the sense that Abraham used it, as a distinct material being and not a spirit. So in this instance, Joseph is equating soul, mind, and spirit as an intelligence. At this point, the prophet makes a distinction between the 3. The account in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith is the lengthiest version on this point. Joseph doesn't mention the mind. Instead, the spirit is placed into a physical body, becoming a living soul. Joseph uses the account in Genesis to support his point. Joseph is using his own translation of the original Hebrew, substituting spirit, specifically Adam's spirit, for the King James breath of life. Whatever you call it, the spirit or the breath of life, it is the animating force placed in the physical body, which then becomes a living soul. This is the classical LDS understanding of spirit, body, and soul as the Lord defined them to Joseph Smith. Spirit and soul and mind, in this formulation, become separate entities. The accounts of Wilford Woodruff, Thomas Bullock, and William Clayton accord with this part of the account in the teachings. In his King Follett discourse, Joseph Smith taught what should have become a fundamental doctrine. He taught that the mind or intelligence of God is eternal, without beginning or end. If it had been believed by the Church, it would have transformed its doctrine. Even today, science has struggled with the origin of the mind, referring to consciousness. Joseph said that man's mind or intelligence is co-equal with God. The Church has struggled with understanding this statement, though it has the plainness that the ancient Book of Mormon prophet Nephi valued. The footnote to this statement in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith expresses dismay at the word co-equal. Joseph couldn't have used that word, and it must be an artifact of a flawed record. But this ignores that 3 of the 4 original accounts in the first composite account reported that the prophet said co-equal. It was the word Joseph Smith used. Only Thomas Bullock diverged, replacing immortal for co-equal. A look at the Webster Dictionary of the time, published in 1828, attests that there was no word co-eternal in the American lexicon. On the other hand, co-equal is found with the following meaning. The question, of course, is what did Joseph mean by using co-equal? Thomas Bullock understood co-equal to mean eternal. That was what he wrote down as a replacement in his notes. Joseph Fielding Smith, in his footnote, understood it similarly. He argued that co-equal should have been co-eternal. This is likely the primary sense of what Joseph was driving at. He said as much a moment later. He then used co-equal, directly linking it with the eternal nature of both God and spirits. The bracketed co-eternal was inserted by Joseph Fielding Smith, who objected to the use of co-equal. But why the objection? If everyone understood co-equal to mean eternal in this context, then what could be the objection? Joseph Fielding Smith was objecting to any suggestion that the mind of man is equal to God. But this is not what Joseph believed or meant. Later in the same discourse, Joseph made it clear that God was a higher intelligence than man. Man was capable of enlargement to godhood, but was not equal with God from the beginning. To properly understand the prophet, we need to look at the context. Joseph was not comparing God and man in mortality, but as intelligences. That is, man's mind or intelligence was co-equal with God's mind or intelligence. As intelligences, God and man were equal. Before God was God, he was first a mortal man. As Joseph put in the same discourse, God was once like we are now. God became God through enlargement from one degree to the next. This is the essence of the eternal plan, the obtaining of eternal or godly life. Or put differently, God was not always God. He first started at a small degree and capacity. He started as an intelligence and, going from degree to degree, advanced to a spirit, then to a mortal man, and lastly to godhood. In this sense, Joseph was absolutely correct in stating that, in the beginning, man and God were co-equal. Co-equal means, among other things, being equal in the same rank or power. When God was an unembodied intelligence, he was not a god, but simply an intelligence equal to all the other intelligences around him. They were all co-equal in rank and power. Joseph then describes the eternal nature of intelligence as self-existent. Self-existence, as Joseph used it, refers to that existence possessed from one's own nature and not by the act of any other being or cause. This was a radical concept at the time, since only God was believed to be self-existent. Joseph is now applying it to all men. What this means is that man's intelligence was not created, not even by God. Joseph made this very point. Joseph Smith used two terms to designate the self-existent and eternal part of man: intelligence and mind. As we've demonstrated, the prophet did use intelligence within this context repeatedly, but he also used mind. In fact, it appears that mind was his preferred term, as he used it to name his subject. He called the subject the mind of man and not the intelligence of man. The three original reporters who mentioned this statement by Joseph all recorded that Joseph used the term the mind of man. Joseph used mind elsewhere in the discourse. It is the mind that is the immortal part of man, which had no beginning. It is the mind of man that is co-equal with God. The version of the discourse of the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith has it that both mind and intelligence are co-equal with God. This wording seems to equate the two. But three original recorders, Willard Richards, Wilford Woodruff, and William Clayton, state that Joseph only used mind and not intelligence, while the fourth, Thomas Bullock, did not record the statement. Furthermore, it is the mind of man that is susceptible of enlargement. In truth, Joseph used both terms, intelligence and mind, to mean the same thing: an eternal, intelligent being. William Clayton's account makes this clear. The mind is the intelligent part of man, or the seat of intelligence. This was how mind was understood in 1828. If we use the same pattern as we did with the light of Christ, we find that the mind of man, intelligence, has the following characteristics. We also know through the principle of transitivity that since intelligence is equal to the light of Christ, so is the mind of man. It also means that all the characteristics of the mind or intelligence of man can be added to the light of Christ and vice versa. In today's scientific world, the mind of man and its equivalents, intelligence and the light of Christ, would be called consciousness. Dictionaries define consciousness as the mind or mental faculties being comprised of thought, feelings, and will. Conversely, mind is defined in relation to consciousness. Simply put, consciousness is defined as mind, and mind is defined as consciousness. But this really doesn't define the two. It is a definitional loop. The truth of the matter is that neither philosophy or science can explain the existence or nature of consciousness. Philosophers recognize that there is such a thing as consciousness, but have not reached a consensus as to what it is. Science has its own difficulties with consciousness. Founded upon materialism, modern science believes that consciousness must be a product of the human brain. However, science has yet to discover the physical connection between the brain and consciousness. This has become the hard problem of consciousness, as philosopher David Chalmers put it. Or, put another way, what is the connection between mental processes and physical processes? No one knows the answer to these questions, though theories abound. The conundrum of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world has been debated for centuries. It's called the mind-body problem. Generally speaking, there are two lines of thought on the problem: dualism and monism. Dualism proposes that the mind and body are fundamentally different from each other. Monism, on the other hand, proposes that both mind and matter are of a similar nature. Of course, with all things philosophical, there are variations of both lines of thought. The gospel of Jesus Christ sides with the monist, at least in principle. There is no separate and fundamental division between mind and matter. As Joseph Smith explained to the saints in 1843, everything is matter. It only varies in purity, fineness, or grade, but not in nature. Earlier, in 1833, the Lord explained to the prophet that the elements, meaning matter, are eternal. Spirit and matter can be materially connected to each other. In fact, this is the pathway to the fullness of joy. The differences between spirit, soul, mind, or intelligence and the mortal body, then, is not one of nature but of organization. Joseph explained in the King Follett discourse that creation is essentially a process of organization. This principle of organization applies to all forms of element or matter. Element can be organized from an unorganized state, but also reorganized from a lower to a higher state. The earth became a sentient being. something we have discussed in earlier videos through the organization of unorganized elements. This was the example Joseph used in his discourse. But it is also how intelligences are organized into spirits, as the book of Abraham indicates. This implies that procreation and gestation are forms of organizing matter, where intelligences are organized into spirits, and spirits are placed into physical bodies also organized from matter. Healing follows this same pattern of reorganization. Called the law of healing, damaged physical bodies or organs, for example, can be reorganized into healthy bodies or organs through the modality of consciousness. The body itself is an intelligent system and can heal itself through regeneration or repair, both forms of cellular reorganization. The organization and reorganization of element also implies that all matter is intelligent. How else can inanimate matter become living and intelligent souls? Organization and reorganization does not change the nature of element, but only its capacity. Or, expressed in the negative, there is no existence at any level of organization without intelligence. Intelligence defines existence. The idea that the entire universe is made up of consciousness, or intelligence, is an ancient one. In philosophy, it's called panpsychism. Plato was an early proponent of this concept, also called the anima mundi, or world soul. Panpsychism is found in both Western and Eastern esoteric traditions. Panpsychism is making a comeback of sorts in certain scientific circles. Of course, it is formulated in modern language, but it means the same thing. Consciousness is fundamental to everything in our universe. Dean Radin has found this to be the case in numerous scientific experiments. Radin's concept of a consciousness that extends throughout space and permeates all things, forming a fundamental interconnectedness between them, is strikingly akin to the Lord's description of the light of Christ. It fills space and is in all things. It is the power of God by which He governs all things.